Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to DOP214, where this afternoon we're going to dive into some of the best practices, lessons learned that we've seen working with customers as they're taking generative AI into their software engineering processes. My name is Joe Cudby, Principal Go-to-Market Specialist at Amazon in our Next Gen Dev Experience team. We're the folks that work with software development teams and our customers' organizations to understand how they do things and where they're looking to improve. With me today, I have Erin Kramer. She's the head of product in our Amazon Software Builder Experience team. Those are the folks that undertake the somewhat gargantuan challenge of understanding how to optimize software development across all of Amazon. And so I'll start out today and then hand over to Erin. So let's dive in. So where I want to start here a little bit is, why is software engineering changing? Why are we seeing this sort of impetus to make some kind of change? We're going to dive into this idea of the fact that we're changing behaviors with these changes. I'd like to poke a little bit at productivity versus toil. I tend to think of those things as two sides of the same coin, but they're very much related in sort of this process. We're going to take a look at how we start these changes to intake and make AI part of your software development process. We're going to talk a bit about measuring change. I've been working with these products now and customers for about 2 years, and so what I consistently see is this idea of measurement, right? How do we baseline? How do we understand what we're doing as being critical? So we'll spend some time there. We're going to talk a little bit about the enhancements to Q developer metrics and the information we provide and how that can now help you on your journey to this sort of adoption. And then I will be excited to hand over to Erin to talk about the ASBX and an Amazon journey. So, what's causing these changes and these pressures to change our software engineering processes? I'd say there's the two broad buckets here, right? There's the sort of top-down pressure. We see this consistently in talking to our customers, right? We hear, hey, we're looking to generate more value to our customers. We need to deliver new capabilities. We need to do new products. But also with our existing products, we're looking to increase our adoption, maybe increase our Net Promoter Score, NPS. And also, there are market pressures. We hear this from our customers. They're being encouraged and in many ways compelled to compete with the software products that they're building. What we also know is that there is innovation coming from our individual development teams, individual innovative developers who are playing with these tools, this new cool tech, trying to figure out how to make it work for them. How do I take these new cool technologies in my job that I've been doing maybe for decades in my workflows and understand how to take advantage of these things, right? I'm looking to maybe automate something, do something at a bigger scale, and ultimately remove toil. They're also looking to take on new challenges, bigger, more complex, more complexity, more performance requirements, harder challenges, and also looking to broaden, right? This idea of breadth, where our software engineering folks are looking to maybe learn new languages, right? A typical conversion might be Java to Rust, something like that. And so we've got these sort of competing objectives of the need to change and in many ways the desire to change. But what we also know is that the presence of toil has a universal impact on the ability to change. So the desire is there, the motivation is there, but the ability is impacted by the existence of toil. So I want to take just a moment here and bring a couple of mental models for the idea of the way that software engineering works. As I've talked to a lot of customers over the past couple of years, there are some themes that sort of appear. And at some level, there is some notion here that software engineering feels a bit like a factory, right? Code is a widget, where all lines of code are equal. All projects are equal. Perhaps this homogeneity means that we can have a single and effective way to measure what we're doing. And frankly, productivity increases are easy to calculate, right? If you've ever worked in a factory, you bring in a new tool, things get faster, super easy. But I think and I would be willing to bet the software developers in this room will probably say, well, hang on a minute, that's not the way this works. And so if we take Drucker's model of knowledge work and apply that to software engineering, I think we'll start to see how this gets a little more challenging and a little more complicated. So we could probably agree that not all lines of code are equal based on the business purpose. What am I trying to build? What am I trying to accomplish? What does this thing do? Also, not all workloads, projects are the same. Maintaining a 50-year-old COBOL mainframe is a very different thing to building a mobile app, right? We can't treat these things from the perspective of an understanding and a measurement and a sort of expectation of toil. We can't treat them the same. This heterogeneity demands flexibility in measurement and thinking. When we have conversations with customers and they're telling us, hey, we've got, as I said, a mainframe. We've also got mobile apps. We've also got microservices. We also have some other monoliths, right? These things are not the same. They can't be treated the same. We also should be empowering our development teams to have context, the why they're building. Why are they building what they're building? What's the value of it? Who does it help? Who's it impacting? What's the outcome of what it is that they're building? And then that, combined with autonomy, enables development teams to make smart choices and come up with creative solutions to get to the right outcome. When Aaron will talk a little bit about this, but this is how we think about software engineering across Amazon. And we really do embed a lot of this within our sort of peculiar culture, if any of you have heard of that before. So with that said, and I'll refer back to these, let's talk about this thing about toil, right? Because I've said it a few times now. So Joe, what's this whole toil thing you keep talking about? What are the characteristics of toil? And I'm taking these from, for those folks in here that are familiar with the site reliability engineering, SRE kind of discipline, that's where these characteristics are coming from. I'm choosing to apply those to software engineering, so we have a common ground. So what are the characteristics? Typically, manual, right? It's something that I have to do. If we think about software engineering, there's two big categories. Documentation, typically manual, right? And code review, typically ends up being manual today. Repetitive. What do we have to do over and over and over again? I would hypothesize most people would say unit test generation is a repetitive activity. It's something that we hear consistently from customers where they want to get better test coverage. They want to do more, but it's not something their developers enjoy doing. It's not something they necessarily get done well. Automatable. This is really interesting. Aaron and I had a long conversation about this. I think what we've seen with generative AI is that tasks that were not automatable before now may be. And so there's a different class of activity now that we might consider toil, where a few years ago we might not have done. And I'll give you an example. We think about at-scale solutions for things like patching and upgrades. Those are things that, until fairly recently, with the capabilities of AI, were really challenging to do at scale. Tactical. These are typically things that are interrupt-driven. I might suggest that build failures, pipeline failures, some of these other elements in what we're trying to do with software development would be considered tactical. Limited enduring value, right? Is there enduring value after what we've done? I would say things like, dumping log files and things. There's no enduring value to that, but it's a thing we do. But probably the most relevant of these characteristics is probably this last one. And so as we think about increasing the size of our software estate, there are things that grow in line with that. Documentation increases. Tests increase, but also maintenance, modernization activities, patching activities, technical debt also increases as we grow our software. And so when we have these sort of characteristics of toil in mind, then we can start to see how there's lots of different levers we can pull in order to increase productivity across our software development process, right? And so what you will see, and you'll hear from us when we talk about Amazon Q Developer, we really are focused on removing the toil. In many ways, productivity is a byproduct of removing toil, right? If I can take toil out, then development teams have time, energy available to theoretically do more productive things, right? And so how does that manifest with Q Developer, right? How do we sort of think about this idea of tackling toil? So planning and research. We know that developers spend a lot of time looking for answers to questions, whether it's engaging with their peers, whether it's looking across internal wikis, whether it's looking wherever it is, online, what have you. There's a lot of time being spent in that space. So how can we take Q Developer, with its ability to understand Amazon services, also look at your operating infrastructure, be able to describe existing code, how can we take those things and help simplify this planning and research process? Generating the right code. I use the term the right code very intentionally. I think where these tools were 2 years ago, it was generating code. What we've learned since then is that context matters. It's the context of the project you're working on, the corporate standards. These things matter towards this idea of generating the right code. So in our world, that would include things like customizations, right? You have the ability to curate your internal code repos, bring those to QDeveloper, and generate recommendations that align to the way that you do things. Delegation of tasks to agents. If you saw the keynote this morning, and you will hear a lot this week about the availability and sort of moving to this concept or increasing the concept of agents within Amazon QDeveloper, we really are trying to attack these ideas of toil by being able to assign that task to an agent. And I'll give you 3 examples. So we've taken our security scanning capabilities and improved those dramatically to now be something that can do sort of the first part of a code review, right? We're trying to take that undifferentiated heavy lifting, that toil away from our senior development teams and have AI do it. So now our development teams, our individual developers can effectively run a code review on their own code, run it on their machine, and fix those issues before they ever commit and before it starts creating impact on your senior devs. Documentation. I hear this consistently. I've been a developer. I know this is a challenge, right? The documentation is often not accurate or not reasonable. But what we also know is that the time taken to onboard new developers into an old code base can be considerable. In this world of productivity, there's this idea that we talk to customers about time to first commit. How long does it take before your developers are actually usefully engaged in your code base? A lot of that is dependent on the accessibility and availability of documentation. So, as I mentioned before, in this world of toil, right, documentation was manual and it also scales in line with your code base. So taking that to heart, we've now got the capability to generate documentation as part of QDeveloper, right? So I'm sitting in my IDE, I can trigger an agent to go actually look at the code base, do some summarization, and start to generate documentation. Unit test generation, as I mentioned before, it's repetitive, scales in line with the code base. So we're taking additional steps to make unit test generation that much more effective, take some of that toil out of the process, and give your development teams time back. What we also know is that test generation, also test coverage, is also a way to de-risk the frequency of updates and the things that you're trying to do with your code, right? If you've got 10% code coverage, it's much more risky to release something than if you've got 80 or 90%. So these are all things that are now capabilities within QDeveloper, and they're all specifically targeted at these big elements of toil. Now, what we also know, and I hear this consistently in talking to development teams, I've seen it with my own experience and my own colleagues, using AI in software engineering is a cognitive shift. It is a change. If you've been writing code the same way for 10 or 15 years, and now we give you this new tool set, and it's a different type of interaction, it's going to take you a minute to understand how to make it work for you, right? And so we're going to come back to this point over and over and over again, this idea of behavioral change. And how do we incent that? How do we operationalize it? How do we simplify it? Because that really is probably one of the most critical points in this idea of customer journeys and our own internal journey with the adoption of generative AI in software engineering. Just before I hop off this, the one other agent I didn't talk about, but we talked about in the prior slide, this idea of scaling with the size of your code base, right? It's this idea of patching and maintenance and breaking changes. So a year ago, we launched the agent for code transformation. At that point, we were supporting Java updates. You may have heard today, we launched in preview the ability to support .NET to .NET Core. We really are trying to understand and take this element of deprecated runtimes, like old versions, and make that something that AI can accelerate. It's not a silver bullet, but is absolutely an accelerant to those processes. So with that said, how are expectations being managed? This is something that in probably, I'd say 90% of customer conversations, this is something that comes up. What are the expectations around the impact of these tools as part of software development, and how fast do executives expect those things to show up? There are typically expectations around who is the internal executive champion for whom this matters, this change matters, and will they be engaged in this over the long term? Will they be the ones incenting enduring change, making this a priority over time? We might say that if we go back to those first things I showed about why we're changing, many of those are time-bound, right? We're trying to do more faster, new capabilities, releases. So where one would expect that a top-level expectation here is very much time-based. They want it to happen quickly. Change should happen quickly. We want to get to the benefits of this. But for any of the folks in this room that have ever tried to go on a diet or take up exercise, right, enduring change takes time. It takes time to build the muscle. It takes time to unlearn the way that you've been doing it and learn new things. The other critical part here, I would say, is the perspective on the gains, right? If we go back to that idea of the factory model, it should be easy to measure, but it's not. We know that it's not true. But it is an interesting conversation with execs on understanding how do we identify and report gains? How do we justify? I hear the conversation about ROI a lot. I mean, these tools are relatively inexpensive, but there is still a cost associated with, so how do we justify those things? So we really do have to understand that these are the expectations, and in many ways, these expectations have to be managed for these kinds of adaptations and behavior changes to work. So, bottoms up. What do we know? So, within any population, right, there's some subset of innovators, maybe 15%, 18% of the population, who will just try it because it's cool. And they're really into it, and they're trying these new technologies, and they really want to figure out how to make it work for them. What's it capable of? How does it work for me? And what we also know is that the vast majority of people, the next 60 or 70%, need these tools to provide value and provide utility and work. And so the majority of your development teams will require a way to figure out how to make Amazon Q Developer work for them. It is a behavior change. How do I make these tools work for me? So what we would typically recommend in this instance is if you're rolling out the tool, make sure you're rolling out to entire teams. At Amazon, we call those two pizza teams. I've also called it pods, scrum teams, those types of things. What we find is that they are much more effective in being self-referencing, where the experience of one of those team members can then be reinforced with others. And so we're sharing communication and collaboration about how to solve problems within that particular project, that repo, that application. Right? We then talk about the need for internal support and training. I would say with any piece of software that's being rolled out, I'm talking about things like how does your help desk understand how if one of your developers calls with a ticket about these things, right? Some simple operational things, but they do matter. What you may have noticed, and you will probably see over the next few days, is the pace of innovation in this with these tools is incredibly rapid. So the tool that your development teams get today may be different to the thing that they will be experiencing in 60 or 90 days, maybe even 30 days. So how are we enabling these teams internally to understand new features, capabilities, options to reduce toil, right? Options to scale, new agentic type behaviors. And so what we would encourage customers to do, and what we've seen work reasonably effectively, is this idea of a community of practice, or maybe what also known as champions. How are you identifying the folks within your organization that are going to take the time and be motivated to engage and understand the huge range of capabilities and how to make these tools work for them in the projects and things that they're working on within the construct of your organization? Another conversation. This happens 90% of the time. How do we measure this, right? We've got expectations. Expert management wants some kind of measurement. They want to see some kind of outcome for this tool. How do we go about measuring this type of software development process, right? You've told me it's not a factory, so it must be harder. So how do we think about this? And I'd say there's two broad categories of types of data points. There's the quantitative. It's machine generated. So when you think about that, it would be examples of time series data, right? It might be, hey, it takes this long to do a build. It takes this long in Jira to do a PR. We know it takes this long to gather requirements, right? Those are all time-bound things, typically with machine-generated date stamps, so you can figure out the velocity pretty quickly. We also know that many of our customers instrument their pipelines with quality tooling, maybe SonarQube, something else. But there's tooling there that can do quality assessment over time. Security assessment, same thing. Tools within the pipeline to look at security trends over time. The last one here, outcomes, is a little harder to gather, but is also important. Earlier I said this idea of the right code. If we understand the outcome of the thing we just built, we can have a better sense of the value of it. What I mean by that is, if we're looking at a code, are we looking at the adoption of that feature? Are we looking at the revenue generated from that feature? Are we tracking the increase in NPS? What kind of outcome data do we have reliability, right? Those kinds of things. Typically a little harder to gather. Many customers that I've talked to, many dev teams aren't really thinking in this way, but it's incredibly helpful to start to understand how might you gather this kind of information as we're trying to get through this change of implementing AI in software engineering. So the other side of this, qualitative, human-generated. So typically what we would see with customers is sending out surveys, right? Maybe it's a weekly survey, maybe it's once per sprint. And on that survey, there's typically numeric values, right? Some sort of range, 1 to 5, 1 to 10, something like that. And so there's a number of questions there where you are gathering numerical data generated by humans, and you can track those trends over time. What's also incredibly valuable there is the free-form feedback. The free-form is the why things are happening, the anecdote, the story. And so by looking at the data that's being generated as well as the anecdotes that are coming in sort of free-form feedback, you can start to understand, well, okay, so there's toolings there, but are there other wishes? Well, hey, this is great, but I'm still getting build failures, right? So how do we start surfacing information about other places in your software engineering processes where there's opportunities to remove toil? So we sort of got this idea that there's pressure for change. We know we're changing behaviors. We've had an opportunity. We understand sort of how to measure it a little bit. And now we're getting to this idea of baseline. We have to be able to baseline and establish the current state. Typically, what I would encourage customers to do is whatever you're doing today, just use that, right? Whatever measurements you've got, whatever the tools you have, just use what you have, baseline it, implement the tool, and start looking at trends over time. But then when we get to a broader conversation around, well, are there frameworks, ways to think about this problem? I would typically encourage customers to look at two things. First one is DORA. I suspect many of the folks in this room are familiar with the DORA metrics. This is a way to look at the technical implementation of your pipelines, understand how they work, look at your relative maturity, and identify lots of opportunity within the pipeline process itself to identify toil and look for opportunity. Space. Space is a really interesting framework. It's not prescriptive necessarily in telling you what to measure, but it does give you really nice categories for thinking about it. So satisfaction and well-being. Performance being your outcomes. A, activity. So this is actions and outputs. This is where you're tracking the number of things that you do. C, communication and collaboration. You'll hear me talk about communication and collaboration here quite consistently. And then E is sort of efficiency and flow, right? How well did devs stay in sort of the flow state. With any of these frameworks, they represent a journey. It's not something you're going to go to work tomorrow and then all of a sudden you'll have categories for everything in space. But it is a great way to think about what an end state might look like. And Aaron will sort of talk a little bit about how we went through our own internal metrics process and our internal frameworks. And what you'll hear is that we've basically taken some elements of these two and kind of created our own way of thinking about it. So what are some best practices? What have we learned about this journey and undertaking it? I cannot emphasize this enough. Culture is critical. I have heard from a number of development teams, hey, we are too busy with deliverables and dates. We don't have time to investigate this. We don't have time to figure this out. This idea of giving our development teams permission to play is critical. We have to be willing to take a short-term reduction in what might be considered your output, story points, however you measure it, and give our development teams that ability to play and figure out how to make these tools part of their workflow. We are asking them to change their behavior. We need to give them opportunities to do so. Managing expectations. I've said this a couple times. Managing expectations up. Here's what is likely to be the impact. Here's what the timing is likely to be. But also managing the development teams. When you're using tools like this, at this point, you are having to embrace failure. It's not going to work every time. But when it does work for you, and it does deliver value, and it does solve problems within what you're trying to do, the results can be incredible. Alignment of incentives. It was funny, I was talking to a customer yesterday in an executive meeting, and this came up. And we were talking about how do we encourage change for our developers to start adopting these tools. And in many ways, unfortunately, we're talking about organizational change management, right? We're talking about how we get things adopted in a large organization. And we talked about incentives. So what do I mean by this? Let's say, for example, that as part of your MBOs or something for this year, there's some element of either training or certification, maybe community engagement, maybe training peers, something like that. Is there an opportunity here to align the use of Q as a champion back to that corporate goal? Maybe. So how do we think about aligning incentives? If you're incentivizing your development teams based on existing tooling and existing behaviors, and now we're asking to change that, do we need to change incentives? Maybe. It's worth a conversation. We need to engage teams, not just innovators. I said this a little bit. What we know is whether it's Scrum teams, pods, two-pizza teams, these tools become more effective when the entire team is using it. So if you're looking to engage, if you're looking to do POCs, POVs with these kind of things, pick teams, not necessarily individuals. There we go. It may come as a shock, it may not. Developers don't spend all the time writing code. Depending on the surveys you look at, it can be anywhere from an hour to 2 hours a day, and there's a lot of other time when they're not. So again, from an expectations perspective, if you have this factory mindset where we've got developers spending 8 hours a day writing code, that's not really the way it works. So we need to be thinking about that. Writing code is not the biggest constraint for most teams. When we look at the process for getting software from an idea out to actually in production, getting it written may not be the biggest constraint in there. And so if the advantage of Dora, when you look at your process, you can identify these other constraints and other roadblocks. And maybe in addition to optimizing the generation of the right code, maybe there's an opportunity to look at these other places as well. The objective, as I said, should be writing the right code to build the right solution. I would suggest that the most productive outcome is not writing any code at all if it's already been solved within your organization, right? Don't duplicate effort. If I don't duplicate it, then I'm not creating downstream impact in terms of documentation, tests, maintenance, and so forth. I'm not avoiding the tech debt. So as we're thinking about these tools and putting AI as part of your process, are there other places where we can surface more information and not necessarily just generate code faster? Supporting collaboration with and across teams, I've said this a bunch of times, you're going to be sick of me saying it, but there is an enormous amount of value to being able to look across teams and understand how they're collaborating, sharing the best practices from one to the other. So here are some typical questions we get asked using Amazon Q Developer and the metrics that we perform, right? How do I know who's using Amazon Q Developer? This was a challenge for a while, but if you go into the Amazon Q console now, the licensing console, you can actually get an export of all of the users, their license status, and a last active date. Now you can have a very clear and easy way to know who has or has not used the tool within some period of time. What we also launched within the past couple of weeks was daily metrics. This is something we've been asked for. How do we know not only who's using it, but who are our champions? Who are our heavy users, right? Where are our successes coming from? So now you can go into the Amazon Q Developer console, you can turn on user metrics, give an S3 bucket, and then at the end of each day, we will provide a CSV file that basically shows these are the humans and these are the lines of code that were generated. How will I be able to see usage and trends? For any of the folks that have seen the Amazon Q Developer console, the dashboard, we've done a lot of work on that, and actually that's been released within the past week or so. And so now we're actually able to show you a lot more information and aggregate trends. So now you'll be able to see, we have standardized on this idea of lines generated, and that will be consistent across the various modalities. So you're looking at inline code gen, inline chat, chat/dev, code transform, all of those will be reported in terms of lines generated. You'll also see the activity for the agents. How many documents have been created? How many unit tests have been created? How many reviews have happened? You can really start to get a sense of aggregate trends across your organization. All of this data is also available in CloudWatch and CloudTrail. So if, as with some of our customers, you choose to take this data out and put it in some additional dashboard, you can absolutely do that. So how do we take this data and use it to support organizational change? The A in space, activity. The information that we provide is definitely in this actions, right? It's activity, it's outputs. It's not productivity gains. So when you take the data that we provide you and you slot it into the A for space, you'll notice that there's 4 other categories there that we don't cover, right? Because we can't see it. So the information that we provide is absolutely a part of the story. It is not the entire story. The other thing is, from this perspective of how do I manage a rollout, how do I know what's happening in my organization, how do I identify my champions and support that? Now we've got the user license metrics and also the activity to really help you understand how you're rolling these tools out and getting adoption across your organization. So with that, I would love to hand over to Aaron to dive deeper into the Amazonian lessons. Thanks, Aaron.
Thank you, Joe. How many of you are using AI in your own work, regardless of what you're doing? All right, quite a few of you. How's that going? Good? Excellent. Of course, you're early adopters, and that's why you're here. My name is Erin Kramer. I've been actively involved in building software at Amazon for nearly a quarter of a century. And I am now the head of product for Amazon's internal developer tooling team. I'm here today to share with you some of the insights that we've gotten out of bringing AI into that developer tool chain. So like a lot of you, AI is new for me, right? It's something that I got a call from one of my executive sponsors. I think it was probably in April 2023, and he's like, Aaron, AI. I'm like, sure. Calls me again. Aaron, AI, you should take a look at this stuff. I'm like, okay, cool, I'll dive in. And so as I came up to speed in this stuff, I started learning that some of the emergent properties of it actually seem really interesting for the space that I get to work in, helping developers be more effective. So when I'm looking at ways that I can assess this stuff on behalf of Amazon's developers, I'm looking for ways that it helps them do things like achieve a state of flow, right? By removing unnecessary friction and toil. But before we get into some of the AI stuff, let's talk a little bit about the approach that we generally took when I and a few other people got to form Amazon Software Builder Experience in 2022. So we got the chance to go to Amazon's senior executive team, if you know what the S team is, Andy Jassy and his directs. We got to go to the S team and basically make the case that investment in the developer experience, investment in the tooling workflows for developers, and improving that was critical for Amazon's business. And they bought it. Cool. So then what I got to do was I got to go grab a bunch of teams from across the company who owned various constituent parts. So that includes things like our code build and deployment systems, our ticketing, paging, and task management systems, a bunch of our operational tools, and a bunch of our knowledge sharing tools. So what we got when we brought this new organization together was a set of tools that were amazingly powerful, right? They've been building and running Amazon for a few decades. But they were built with this tooling mindset, not with an outcome mindset. So one of the very first things that we focused on was building up this kind of muscle, the capabilities that we needed to focus more on those outcomes. And that meant figuring out how to measure what really matters. For us, we'll call it an input measurement, but it's about enabling builders to build and maintain the software that drives the breadth of Amazon's businesses. Now, I'm going to acknowledge that's an input measurement, right? Successful software build and deployment and support is an input to drive the business. There's a whole other talk that we could do on how that drives effective business stuff, but again, that's a whole other talk. All right, so we get started in 2022, and we need to get moving, but I haven't built measurement yet. All right, so how do we get moving? Well, the first thing we did was actually started with expert opinion. Right? I talked to a whole bunch of people at the company. And some of the things that we started looking at was we knew there was a lot of opportunity, of course, in kind of creating some tailwinds from improving the tools themselves and things like that. That was definitely there. But what we started hearing was there was a whole lot more opportunity in those headwinds, the things that were getting in the way of developers doing their work. So we started with some, we'll call it anecdata. You'll hear some nice round numbers from me right here. 30% of developer time was spent on things like patching, upgrades, mandatory campaigns, things like that. 25% of developer time was being spent on on-call operations, things like that. Now, did I have exact numbers? Of course I did not. But as I went and talked to people around the company, those felt like about the right order of magnitude. And that 30% number, wow, there was a lot of opportunity in there. That's a big headwind. That's a lot of toil. So we started digging into that. One of the other big things that we knew when we started ASBX, and Joe mentioned this, is that culture matters, right? We had to function in a way that was consistent with Amazon's peculiar culture. So what does that mean for us? Well, first, we have to respect this culture of end-to-end ownership. This is a big part of what makes Amazon, Amazon. It also meant that we could lean into things like Amazon's culture of automation, right? I could start building automation in places that they weren't, and that would be culturally acceptable within Amazon. It meant that I could use tools like data-driven insights to drive change, and I'll provide a specific example of that in a minute. And of course, everything we did would need to hold a very, very high bar for privacy and security, of course, externally, but also internally. I deal with a lot of Amazon employee data, for example. Privacy and security on that is absolutely critical. So let's talk a little bit about some of the measurements that we're doing. One of the first things we started doing, think kind of space framework, was we started organizing our measurements into pillars. The first one that we did is what we're going to call systems health. This is the things that you'd expect, right? This is things like availability, latency, cost efficiency. These are things that Amazon has been measuring for a very, very long time. And ultimately, for me, while I might be able to improve some of these things with tools, and if I do, that's amazing, the biggest thing that I'm watching for here is this is a failure indicator, right? If, as I make changes to tooling and workflows, this starts to degrade, oh man, do I need to stop what I'm doing? And I need to understand what has changed, right? Because I cannot negatively impact those measurements as we're making changes in the system. Next up was delivery health. This looks a lot like your traditional DORA type measurements, right? These are things like change lead time, deployment frequency, and of course within there I've got things like deployment failure rates, rollback rates, recovery times, and things like that. And for those last two, Amazon spent a lot of time historically working on deployment rate, failure rates, and rollbacks and things like that. So my numbers there are actually really healthy. Again, those are failure indicators for me as I'm making changes to the tooling systems. Also within this set, we've got some what we'll call underlying input measures, right? These individual measures, they're not an outcome, but one, they are things that are really interesting to drive good behavior. And they also give us some interesting opportunity to look at things that are controllable within our systems. So one of the very, very first ones we did was something that we're calling manual interventions in CI/CD pipelines. So imagine you've got full CI/CD, everything is theoretically automated, but periodically something gets stuck, right? You've got a flaky test, you've got some build failure, something like that, and some developer has to come in and kick that theoretically full CI/CD pipeline forward. So when we started ASBX, we went and counted those. It was big. We had a lot of full CI/CD pipelines, and holy crap, there was a lot of manual interventions there. And so imagine what this is. This is a developer working on something, they think they're done, they've gotten to ship it, they've merged it, it's building, it's out deploying, they're off doing something else, and they have to stop what they're doing and go kick the pipeline again and again. So one of the very first things we did as a team was we started displaying the number of manual interventions in a pipeline within our pipelines tool. That's it, that's all we did. And in the first year, we reduced the number of manual interventions by 33%, just by showing the right number at the right place at the right time, right? So when you're doing a lot of measurement, being thoughtful about what you're measuring, thinking about the behaviors you are going to drive when you use those measures is important. There's lots of stuff that you can measure. There's lots of stuff you should measure. There are some measures you should share. There are some measures that might create some adverse behaviors if you share them, so be thoughtful about that. Our third major pillar is what we call team health. This is things like developer well-being, satisfaction, perception. So basically, as a development experience team, we figure if teams are feeling good, if their software delivery is healthy and our systems are healthy and stable, then things are looking pretty good. We're doing a good job. If any one of those are askew, then we've got a problem. All right, so what does that have to do with AI? Well, when we started looking to adopt AI into our tool chains, these are the measurements that we were looking at, right? And of course, underlying measures and things like that too. But ultimately, these are the things that we're keeping an eye on to understand how AI changes our workflows, changes our developer experience. So for the rest of this talk, I'm going to dive into a couple of different examples of where we pulled AI in and what we found. So a lot of you have probably heard a little bit about our code transformation story. Our team was the one that got to do Java upgrades within Amazon. And this one actually goes back, as I said, to the origin of ASBX, right? So that 30% number of toil around patching and upgrades. So in 2022, one of the first things we did was we built out a team that we put really high caliber developers on the question of how do we remove the toil of patching and upgrades, right? This was something we decided to explicitly invest in. And that team had made actually quite a bit of progress, right? Particularly in the area of non-breaking changes. They were doing really good things. But what we were finding was for breaking changes, things like major version upgrades, there's only so far that we were able to get with technologies like Open Rewrite and Xmog. And we use those a lot. We love them a lot. We use them a lot. But they'd get us up to a point in that transformation, and then a human would need to step in. And at our scale, that friction of, and then a human needs to step in, was prohibitive. In addition, with things like the Java upgrades, it was, for the average team, it was kind of a nice to have, right? It wasn't mission critical. They might get some infrastructure cost savings. It certainly helps, with their patching and things like that. But every time they stack rank that against the new customer features, you're like, yeah, maybe not now. Particularly when there's like 700 different dependencies that need to get changed when you do the upgrade. So the economics of doing this did not work at a local level. But in aggregate, it works out really, really nicely for us. So what happened for us then is, we'd made this progress, and we got stuck. We didn't really know how to get past this roadblock. And then along comes this kind of magical technology of AI at just the right moment. And so what we did is we had the privilege of running alongside the Q team as they were starting to work on the code transformation stuff. And we started to kind of experiment with ways to use it, used it in some pretty novel ways, started integrating it into our internal tool chain, and some of those things are now folding back into the public product. But one of the things we knew is no one was going to be upset if we had an AI assist with software upgrades. And the way that we did it pulled into the tool chain, the reality is most developers don't even really need to know that AI is involved at all, right? The transform tool does the transform. So of course, our first big win was this Java upgrade. By mid-year, we've estimated that we've saved 4,500 dev years of effort within the company on doing that work. And the cost efficiencies in aggregate that we can see from this is we're estimating around roughly $260 million in infrastructure savings from that. So again, no individual team was going to see savings even close to that. But in aggregate, it was huge, but we had no way to get through this roadblock until we had the AI transformations. Now, one of the other things before I move on to the next use case I want to talk about is human perception here. So we built this tool with this idea that we would be able to run it centrally, right? That we would be able to just sweep across huge portions of the code base and send off pull requests to the team saying, hey, we did your Java transform for you. Can you give us a ship it? And good news, I have developers at Amazon that have amazingly high bars. And they're like, there's no way that you got this right. There's no way that you know my service. There's no way that you could possibly get this right. I get the builds work. You're good. And in spite of the fact that we had metrics that said, hey, 80% of our code reviews get a ship it with no changes, this tool really works, we had a lot of friction in getting those code reviews done when we were running the tool centrally. So as we moved along, we had to flip the script. And we took the CLI that we'd built for ourselves to run centrally, and we started shipping it out to the service teams. Remember that end-to-end ownership thing? And we said, hey, could you do us a favor? Could you run this tool for us? Exact same tool. But when they got to see it working, they trusted it way more. And we got a lot more traction in this. So this has been an interesting learning for us. We had this idea that we'd be able to just do a whole bunch of things centrally and everybody would celebrate. Nope, it turns out we have a really high bar for resilience, and they're the ones carrying the pagers, so we need to let them see the work that we've done. All right, let's talk about our second major use case where we pulled AI in. So knowledge discovery. So there was a Stack Overflow developer survey this year where 53% of respondents said that waiting for answers disrupts their workflow, even if they know where to find the information, right? And this is really consistent with what we're seeing within Amazon as well. I have a huge amount of internal knowledge in varying levels of quality and age and things like that, but I've got a lot of information. But discovery is tremendously difficult. So what we did was we took a bunch of our internal knowledge bases and we integrated it with QBusiness. To date, we've answered over 1 million internal developer questions this year, saving an estimated, we're guessing about 450,000 hours of effort to find and also provide, because remember, oftentimes when you're looking for an answer, you're disrupting somebody else, answers to technical questions. Now, one of the things we should note is actually we started building this before QBusiness was available to us. We were building a bespoke internal solution, and we'd been working on it for a little bit. Q1 timeframe, we started benchmarking QBusiness against our internal solution, because turns out quality is important to us, and we always want to check to see before we switch tools over. And QBusiness started benchmarking better than our bespoke solution, so we flipped over Q1 and haven't looked back since then. So how did we do this? To get this result, the first thing we really focused on doing was we curated in high-quality content into this knowledge base. We have a lot of information. We did not just throw it all in. We picked what we put in. We made sure that we were putting quality content in the first place. The next thing we do is we scope the responses with absolutely as much context as we can get our hands on to increase the relevance. We then integrated this capability into tools that we already had. So we have an internal Q&A service that developers are already used to using to get answers to questions. We built it right in there. So if they ask a new question in our Q&A service and there's not already an answer, and it falls within the scope of what we think we can answer well with the AI, we'll try to give it an answer with the AI. We're getting probably more than 50% accuracy in our responses based on kind of like thumbs up or other positive signals saying we did it. So far, it's actually looking pretty good. But while we know, like in this case, while developers do know that the answers are coming from AI, by adding it to the capabilities where they're already working, they don't really need to care. The other thing that we learned through some of this experimentation is we had this initial perception that we would need a really, really high accuracy bar to launch this. But we decided to lean into it because this was a relatively new tech and we knew the user experience was going to be a little different. And so it turns out that we actually didn't need to be as accurate as we thought we did. More than 50% turns out to be still really helpful. Developers seem to be really liking this. What we're really finding is where the value for this is it points them in the right direction. And then we show our work, we show references so that they can get answers from there. So think of it a little bit like Wikipedia, right? Going to Wikipedia is a great place to get started, but that reference section at the bottom is where the real meat is. And so this functions in very similar ways for us. All right, last one, QDeveloper. So of course, we've been adopting QDeveloper as our internal developer assistant. Unlike those last two examples, where we were able to put these AI capabilities into workflows that already existed, QDev is definitely a bigger cognitive shift for our developers. I think that we are at the beginning of a journey on this one. This tech isn't magic yet, but it does now have true utility. I think within probably 3 to 5 years, as the industry continues to invest in this, it's going to feel pretty magical, probably about half a decade. And I think we're going to look back at what we have now and say, well, that was really cute. Look at what it can do now. So my team, as I said, gets to work pretty closely with the Q team. We've seen a lot of improvements this year. So I was going to share a few ones that we're hearing good things from our developers on. So the first one is understanding new code bases. So within Amazon, it is really common that you're working in code that you do not know. Whether you are building something and you need to work in somebody else's service, there is reorganization, and you suddenly own something new. It's a very common scenario that you need to comprehend a new code base, and we're hearing good feedback for Q for that. Next up is new languages. Amazon is a polyglot development environment. We have a lot of different languages in-house. Individual teams may use multiple languages, and we actually don't even hire for a specific language. We hire for general engineering skills, so it is not uncommon that you might be working in a language that you're not particularly familiar with. We heard of feedback from one developer who was starting their first Rust project, and they said typically they spend about 3 weeks coming up to speed in the syntax of a new language, and before they feel like they can actually be productive coding in something. And with Q, they were able to dive in and feel like they were actually able to code productively within the first week. So that was a nice win there. Of course, we love it for things like unit tests. Writing documentation, particularly for our non-native English-speaking colleagues, is something that we hear a lot of positive feedback. And even with the tool as it's been over the last year, our developers are already using it to pre-review their code before they ship it off to their friends, and I know there's a lot more investment in code review coming. So one of the most charming, fun pieces of feedback we heard from one developer is that Q helps them get unstuck because it functions like a rubber duck that can actually talk back. So if you're not familiar with this concept of rubber duck debugging from the pragmatic programmer, the basic concept is you've got a rubber duck on your desk, and you're stuck, and you sit and you explain your code line by line to the rubber duck. And that through that explanation process, developers frequently find themselves able to get unstuck. And so with Q, now the duck can talk back and help them. All right, so before we move on, you're probably wondering about measured outcomes here. I do have some early measurements that indicate a positive increase in change velocity with no negative increase on systems health when these tools are in usage. My science team is amazing. They're doing a lot of peer review right now. Once we have all of that data through peer review, we're going to be excited to share that out. So let's talk a little bit about Q developer adoption best practices. So as we've mentioned, this is a change to workflow. You cannot expect that you're going to just throw this tool at busy developers and it's all going to magically work out. So within Amazon, we've done things like build internal prompt engineering training with internally relevant code examples and use cases to help developers understand how to get the most out of this. Of course, your early adopters are going to jump in fast, right? Those people are going to be lovely. You're going to really like them as you continue to do your enablement work, because you're going to have this pragmatic majority who have really excellent set workflows that they've been using for years, if not decades, and they're going to need some enablement and encouragement to take a step back and try it out. As Joe mentioned, this is why we encourage a team focus, right? This is not about the individual. Every individual is going to have a different workflow. Every individual is going to use this differently. But what you're looking for is that kind of collective, healthy communication as a team. And then you're going to want to find your rubber duck stories, right? Your early adopters will likely find these for you, and you're going to want to listen to those folks, survey them, give them a voice and a platform to share that with their teams. And finally, while of course this stuff can generate code, it generates code. That's what it does. That's actually not its biggest source of value. We think that the value really is as a tool that enables smart people to remove friction from their own jobs. All right, so before we wrap up, let's talk a little bit about some of the things I'm excited about in this space. Because as I've mentioned, my team gets a chance to run alongside the Q team and use it in some of the, we'll say, more exploratory and speculative, sometimes not always going to work first try sort of ways. One of the first really big ones, and this actually came from my dev team, was build and merge failures. So we were sitting down and we were brainstorming ways that we thought AI could help us get through bottlenecks that we'd had before. And based on some of the learnings that we had had from our code transformation work, our dev team had a really strong suspicion that this stuff would be very helpful with build and merge failures. I have a lot of build and merge failures in-house every week, and there is not a single developer who will be sad if I make those go away. In fact, this is the single top ask on pretty much every dev survey we have ever had, is make merging and building easier. And we do keep investing in it, but it's quite the uphill battle. So we actually think AI has a really good chance here of making some significant changes. My team actually released an internal prototype, I think it was about a week ago, tackling, I think, roughly 15% of our build and merge failures. They haven't given me the data on the results yet, so I'm looking forward to seeing how that goes. If it works, we're going to be really excited to share that with the Q team and see if we can do that for everybody. Of course, I'm excited about transformations. You saw our numbers before. I don't think Java's my biggest opportunity for transformations, to be totally frank. And when I look at the fact that that's what we were able to do in the first year of using this technology, I can't wait to see how far we can push this. And we're gonna push it pretty hard to see how bold we can get with transformations, while of course maintaining that system's health, right? That's always gonna be something we're gonna be keeping an eye on. Customization. What I hear from my developers is they really want these systems to understand our peculiar code, our peculiar tools. I have a massive code base, and I'm really excited to see how far I can push customization to understand everything in my possession. Code reviews. We're already hearing some good initial stuff on this, but I think this is another interesting bottleneck, right? We are not going to be at a spot where we're going to take humans out of code reviews anytime soon. We get a significant amount of value out of it. But if we can get the rote code reviews taken care of, that's going to be pretty amazing. And frankly, if I have an AI that can review on par with one of my more highly skilled developers, that unlocks a lot of possibilities, like third-party code ingestion pre-checks and things like that. Documentation. I do have a lot of documentation. I could use more, a lot better. So I'm excited about it for that. And then finally, systems architecture. I think this is going to be a tough one. There is a lot of tacit knowledge in complex systems architecture. I think AIs are just starting to get into this space of tacit knowledge, like things that are hard to convey through traditional knowledge, things that you learned from experience. But I think this is a really worthy space and one I'm excited for the journey. All right, so let's wrap up. When you are pulling AI into your development systems, make sure that you're measuring the outcomes. Sure, like as Joe said, of course you're going to look at lines of code. That's an activity. But the lines of code is not the outcome. So at minimum, look at how it delivers against your system's health. Does it negatively or positively impact that? Your delivery health and your team health, that perception aspect. If you have mechanisms to actually map this to your business outcomes, fantastic, look at those too. I think the killer app for AI in the developer space right now is Toil. Use it, abuse it, absolutely throw as much Toil at it as you can. I think it's really well placed for that. And again, this is where, as Joe said, by removing Toil, you almost by definition get increased focus and productivity out of your developer teams. As much as you possibly can, build this into existing workflows and tools. And when you can't, know that adoption is going to take time and enablement. And finally, give permission to play. If you are a leader in your organization, give them permission to try these tools. I sent out an email to my org a while back saying, hey, you should give this a try. I can see a bump in adoption when I sent that. My peers, who are the kind of org directors, then +1 my note, I see another bump when they sent it. Giving our teams permission to play with this is really important because these people are busy. You're asking a lot of them. Let them know that it's okay to spend time on that. So thank you so much for your time. I hope that you enjoy the rest of reInvent. Please make sure you complete the survey, and I hope to see you around the conference. Thank you.